There's no doubt in my mind that the Calvinistic and Reformed segments of Christianity as of late have been seeing a real resurgence, and that has translated to a renewed interest in the doctrines of grace. Finding a person that believes in tulip is not that rare anymore. Now, one unfortunate thing is that many of the people coming into this are digging into the theological writings of a lot of the older writers, but they're not actually appreciating or even realizing the existence of their poetic works, the hymnody, the poems. I think that when you really look at the poetry of the Puritans, of the American Presbyterians, of the English Baptists, of the Continental Reformers, of the Dutch Reformed, etc., you see a really strong, excellent tradition of poetry. And that's what I like to look at in this video. Now, in all actuality, it's actually not the reading and discovering the poems and poetry of the Reformed and Calvinistic authors that is, per se, the most marginal thing right now. I think an even more marginal thing is having present-day Reformed and Calvinistic Christians writing poetry. I'm not going to say it doesn't happen. It is happening, clearly. You have a lot of great examples. John Piper has written tons of poetry. So has Mike Haken on the Andrew Fuller Center blog. I've been trying to write some poetry. There's also a lot of scattered people that are writing poetry. There's hymn writers. If you look at the Reformed hip-hop movement, you definitely see a great deal of innovative lyrics being written. But if you look at the scene as a whole, I think if you compare it with previous years, we're just not such a people of the verse, people of the word, people of poems. And whereas before, to find a Reformed Christian pastor who is also a poet, it would be very easy. Bunyan, Baxter, the Erskines, just tons of other. Andrew Fuller, you could get tons of them. Now it's kind of rare, like you can get John Piper, maybe a few others. So I think this is unfortunate. I think we who profess the doctrines of grace should be people who love poetry. Now, I want to distinguish that not all our gifts are the same, so I totally acknowledge that there's going to be a pretty large segment of the Reformed community that A, is not writing poetry, and B, may either not read poetry at all, or will have minimal interest, and that's healthy, and I'm not trying to critique that. I'm just trying to advocate a greater and expanded interest in poetry, both in reading and writing it. I've done a few things to try to help this along. You may have read my article on the Aquila Report called Poets and Theologians, and in that article I gave a little bit of a background, listed some characters, discussed the value and also the history of a love for poetry among the Reformed circles. I've also transcribed Hercules Collins' poem. It's a long poem about redemptive history, and you can find that on archive.org. I think that's been pretty important for me because I wanted to read the poem anyways, and it's a pretty long poem. And having to transcribe that poem was very useful in a number of different ways. It gave me motivation to stick with the poem, and it also made it available. That poem was only available either in hard copy or in a scanned copy that had, that the S's that look like F's. It's really hard to read, and it was also not a format that was conducive to copying and pasting, so now that's available. I've also been recording the audio of some poems. I have a, thus far, 2-part series on archive.org. It's MP3 and just various Puritan poems, so you can find them there as well. They're called Puritan Poems 1 and Puritan Poems 2, and I'm planning a third installment of that. So I think what I've done is kind of minor, but I do want to try to continue to help to foster the resources and the information to help Reformed and Calvinistic Christians discover poetry, to love it, and to be able to read it and write it. I'm not exactly sure where this is going to go in the future. One idea that I did come up with is calvinisticpoets.wordpress.com. It's a new blog I put up. It's just in the very early stages, and I'd like to see where that goes. I'd like to be posting some poetry by old Reformed and Puritan writers, and also contemporary ones, so it'll be interesting to see where that goes. But I think I'd like to rewind a bit back and go back to the beginning. Why we should value poetry, and just to review a couple quotes. There's a few quotes that I found that were pretty good. Peter Lightheart, who has written about poetry and the word, put it this way. He said, "We are devotees of the word, people of the book, the Bible. Yet we can't write stories or poetry. This is a scandal." And now, I do think that's a bit of a generalization, but I think it's essentially true. By and large, we just aren't a people of poetry, and yet, you look at our heritage, you look at the fundamentals of our theology, we should be loving words, loving verse, and again, according to our gifts. So I'm not trying to say that people that have no inclination or skill in poetry should have some ability or desire necessarily. I think God gives us different gifts and callings, but within our Reformed Christian community, there should be a good segment of people that are producing excellent poetry, not just on religious subjects either, but poetry that reflects the goodness of God's creation and also the redemption in their lives. There's another quote, it comes from a Baptist poet, actually. His name was John Newton Brown. Now, he's not related at all to John Newton. His last name is Brown, but that was an interesting overlap there between their two names. He wrote a book of poetry called Emily and Other Poems. I believe it was in the 1800s, either 1840 or 1870. And he had this interesting focus in his book. The poem from which the title comes was actually for his sister, who died at a young age. And that poem is just amazing. There's many other great poems in that book. But in the whole book, the thing that most struck me was not necessarily the poetry or the hymns that were included, but actually part of the inscription. He inscribed the book to one of his pastors, and I thought that was a really neat idea. But when you read what he wrote, I think it's a great manifesto for why Christian poets should be writing poetry. Poetic talent, like every other gift of God, imposes upon the possessor a responsibility to cultivate and employ it in obedience to his will for the benefit of mankind, and that as the world will always continue to read poetry, so the more of Christian poetry in the world, the better. I thought that was just a wonderful way of putting it, and pretty much sums up what I had wanted to communicate here. Now, I think Michael Haykin, who posts quite a bit of poetry here and there on the Andrew Fuller Center blog, I think he also had a really good way of putting it. He discussed the situation of Andrew Fuller, and he said, "It is noteworthy that when Andrew Fuller was deeply moved, he would recite out loud lines of poetry that expressed the deep emotions he was feeling." I think that's just a wonderful example of a Reformed Christian who's just breathing poetry. But from Andrew Fuller's situation, now, Michael Haykin actually extrapolates to the present situation. And he said, "Poetry, though, has largely fallen out of favor with many Christian thinkers and theologians since then. This is a shame. There are things that poetry can better express than theological discourse. And this is really one of my concerns. With the resurgence of Reformed theology, you're getting a lot of people getting back into the treatises, the sermons, the polemical pieces, but I think by and large, they're picking and choosing a little and getting certain aspects of the Reformed Christians' writings, and they're good aspects, they're needed. You need the polemics, you need the apologetics, you need the exegesis, but I think they're actually missing part of what was actually going on there. And so then you have people who are picking up the dry and systematic parts of the presentation, but they're ignoring the rich poetic heritage. And I think that could be a problem because you end up getting theologians that are not lovers of words. You're getting theologians that are not tuned into the lyrical sense of things, the way the verses fit together, and I think sometimes it can make the preaching drier. It can even affect areas that would be surprising. Apologetics, I think just even knowing the way words work and having a love for them and the beauty of verse is a important aspect of apologetics. So I think that, you have people coming up to become ministers, to become theologians. They should have a balanced view. They may never specialize in poetry. They may never read tons of poetry, but I think it's like absolutely a shame if you have tons of ministers out there who are Reformed and have not read the poetry of, to take an example, Edward Taylor, George Herbert. Even people like Anne Steele, John Bunyan. And I think it's a little bit shameful that there's a lot of people who just absolutely love Geerhardus Voss for his biblical theology, but yet don't even know that he was quite an accomplished poet. He published at least 2 books of poetry. And I could pick up a bunch of other examples, but I think, unfortunately, some of the theological emphasis comes at the expense of the imaginative, the lyrical, and we really suffer for that. And I think you really have to see poetry as something that has beauty and value in and of itself. So I think there's also a temptation when people who are into theology do delve into poetry that they're just looking for something that's very polemical, something that has X, Y, Z in terms of propositional truths. And that's not wrong. I mean, I write poetry like that. I definitely do. But I think there's a lot of value too in seeing the beauty of words, seeing the way poetry expresses beauty, not for necessarily a particular end of proving this thesis or convincing someone about this or making a statement about this, but rather conveying God's creation through wonderful words. And I really can see the way poetry's been beneficial for me, and I just want to convey that enthusiasm to others. So this video has not been a great apologetic for that, but I hope it'll be profitable for you. And again, the reminder, the blog I put up is calvinistpoets.wordpress.com, and the very first post was a poem from John Newman Brown. Well, I'm going to have to end now. I hope you didn't mind my stammering, and hopefully you could get something out of this. I may continue this thread of thought at some other time, but in the meantime, cheers. Have a good day.